Nobody tells you what the quiet actually feels like. Not the quiet of a peaceful house at night, but the specific quiet that shows up after you finally stop trying, after the last text goes unanswered on purpose, after you stop rehearsing the conversation where they finally understand what they did, after you just leave without a speech, without a scene, without one more attempt to make someone see you who was never really looking. The kind of quiet that follows a meaningful connection has a name, even if almost nobody ever says it out loud. It is not ordinary silence. It is not the silence of two strangers who simply drifted apart. It is the silence that arrives when something important has changed beneath the surface before either person fully understands what has happened. It's the sound of an ending that didn't ask permission. Most people imagine endings as dramatic events. They picture slammed doors, final arguments, tearful goodbyes, or clear declarations that everything is over. Those moments are easy to recognize because they announce themselves. They give the mind a story to follow and a reason to accept what has happened. But some endings refuse to be that generous. They arrive quietly, almost politely, changing the atmosphere before they change the circumstances. One day the conversations become shorter. The laughter feels slightly forced. The excitement that once arrived naturally has to be searched for. Nobody officially ends anything, yet something essential has already left the room. That is the kind of silence that confuses people the most because nothing looks dramatically different from the outside. Daily life continues. Messages may still be exchanged. Smiles may still appear. Routines continue almost untouched. Yet inside, there is a growing awareness that the emotional landscape has shifted. What once felt alive now feels remembered. What once felt effortless now requires intention. The relationship has not necessarily disappeared, but its center of gravity has quietly moved somewhere else. The hardest part about this kind of ending is that it offers no obvious villain. There may be no betrayal, no cruelty, no explosive conflict to point toward. Sometimes people simply stop growing in the same direction. Sometimes fear slowly replaces curiosity. Sometimes comfort becomes stronger than honesty. And sometimes both people continue playing familiar roles long after those roles have stopped reflecting who they truly are. Because there is no dramatic event, the heart keeps looking for one. It searches for the conversation that never happened, the explanation that was never offered, the moment when everything supposedly changed. But life is rarely divided into such clean chapters. Many endings happen one unnoticed decision at a time. One conversation avoided. One truth left unsaid. One moment of emotional distance repeated often enough that it quietly becomes the new normal. That is why people often remain emotionally attached long after the relationship itself has begun fading. They are not only grieving the other person, they are grieving the version of themselves that existed while hope still felt natural. They miss the future they imagined, the conversations they expected to have, the growth they believed they would share. What hurts is not only what happened, it is everything that never had the chance to happen. Silence has a remarkable way of revealing truths that constant communication often hides. When the noise disappears, patterns become impossible to ignore. You begin noticing who consistently reached out and who only responded. You notice whether affection was mutual or mostly sustained by one person's effort. You begin recognizing whether you were loved for who you were or appreciated mainly for what you provided emotionally. These realizations rarely arrive all at once. They gather slowly, like morning light entering a room that was never completely dark. For many people, the instinct is to fight this silence immediately. They send another message, create another opportunity, search for another explanation, hoping that one more conversation might restore what feels lost. Yet silence has its own purpose. It strips away performance. Without constant reassurance, both people eventually reveal what they genuinely value. Interest sustained only by convenience often fades. Genuine care, however, has a way of finding expression even after long periods of uncertainty. This does not mean silence should become a strategy or a game. Silence used to manipulate is still manipulation, but silence accepted as reality creates space for clarity. It allows emotions to settle enough for truth to become visible. Instead of asking, "How do I make this person come back?" a different question quietly emerges. What has this experience shown me about myself? That question changes everything because it shifts attention from control toward understanding. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside an unannounced ending is that identity cannot be built on someone else's presence. Relationships enrich life, but they cannot permanently carry the weight of our self-worth. When another person's attention becomes the foundation of our emotional stability, every moment of distance feels like personal rejection. But when our sense of self grows from within, connection becomes something we can appreciate without desperately clinging to it. Ironically, many people only discover this strength after the relationship has already changed. The silence they feared becomes the place where they finally hear themselves again. They rediscover forgotten interests, neglected friendships, quiet ambitions, and pieces of their personality that had slowly been sacrificed in the pursuit of keeping someone close. The ending, unwanted as it was, becomes the beginning of a deeper relationship with themselves. And sometimes life surprises us. Occasionally, two people who have both grown independently meet again from a different emotional place. If that happens, the reunion is no longer built on fear of loss, but on mutual choice. If it never happens, the growth still remains. The silence has already done its work. That is why this quiet deserves respect rather than immediate escape. It marks the closing of one chapter, but it also protects the possibility of writing a healthier one. Endings that arrive without permission often feel unfair, yet they invite a different kind of courage. The courage to stop demanding certainty from the past and start creating meaning in the present. In the end, the deepest silence is not empty at all. It is full of truths that words could never fully carry. It asks no questions and offers no dramatic speeches. It simply waits until we are ready to hear what was always there. Sometimes the loudest goodbye is the one that is never spoken, because the real ending did not happen in a single moment. It happened quietly, patiently, beneath ordinary days, until one morning you realized that the person you had been waiting for was no longer the one you needed to become. And on the other side of that quiet, something happens that almost nobody talks about honestly. Not the narcissist who caused it, they'll never admit to it, not even to themselves. Not most psychology books either, which tend to describe it in flat clinical terms that don't capture what it actually feels like from either side of that silence. But it's real, and it's worth understanding. Not so you can gloat over someone's suffering, and not as some kind of revenge fantasy dressed up as insight, but because you deserve to know what your presence was actually doing for them and what it means that you took it away. Let's start with you, because most versions of this conversation skip right past you and go straight to analyzing the narcissist, as if you were just a bystander in your own story. You weren't. And the first thing worth saying clearly is this: you are not weak. You were never weak. If you're the kind of person who feels things intensely, who walks into a room and immediately clocks the tension nobody else notices, who senses what's unsaid before anyone says it, that's not a character flaw you need to manage. That's a genuine skill. It's a form of perception most people spend their whole lives trying to develop and never quite get to. But that same sensitivity, that same depth of feeling, is exactly what makes you noticeable to a certain kind of person. Not because you did anything wrong, not because you were careless or too trusting. It's because someone who has built their entire sense of self around pulling emotional energy out of other people can spot your capacity for warmth from across a room. They're drawn to it the way something starved is drawn to food. They need what you naturally generate because they can't generate it for themselves. So whether they're doing it deliberately or not even fully aware of it, they attach to you. And then they start feeding. That's not a poetic exaggeration. It's a fairly literal description of how this dynamic works. What they're feeding on has an actual term for it in psychology: narcissistic supply. It's worth slowing down here, because most people assume this is just about ego, someone who likes compliments, wants attention, enjoys being the center of the room. That's part of it, sure, but it's the shallow end. The real thing runs much deeper than vanity. Think about what it actually means to have a stable identity. It means you can wake up most mornings and know roughly who you are. It means someone can criticize you and you feel bad, maybe even hurt, but you don't come apart. It means you can sit alone with your own thoughts for an evening without needing to escape them. Most people have this, imperfectly, unevenly, but they have some floor beneath them, some core that holds even when things get uncomfortable. A narcissist doesn't have that floor. Underneath the confidence, underneath the charm, underneath whatever polished version of themselves they present to the world, there's an emptiness that's honestly kind of frightening once you really see it. There's no stable center. There's only a fragile structure that needs someone else constantly to confirm from the outside that it's solid, that it's real, that it's enough. That's what you were providing every time you listened patiently, every time you gave them the benefit of the doubt, every time you absorbed one of their bad moods without pushing back too hard, or told them how impressive they were, or made an excuse for behavior that, if you're honest with yourself now, you knew wasn't okay. You weren't just being a supportive partner or friend. You were functioning as their psychological life support. You were the scaffolding holding up a structure that would have collapsed without you. You did that because that's who you are. When you care about someone, you care fully, not halfway, not cautiously. You saw some version of who they could be, maybe a version they showed you on purpose, and you believed in it, and you poured yourself into that belief. You shrank parts of yourself to make room for their needs. You went quiet about your own so you'd have more bandwidth for theirs. You mistook their hunger for love when it was really just hunger. Here's the part that actually breaks people once they see it clearly. And it's not the realization that you were being used. That hurts, obviously, but it's not the worst part. The worst part is looking back and counting how long you allowed it. How many times you went back after telling yourself you wouldn't. How many warning signs you reframed as something more sympathetic because you wanted to believe the best about them. How much of yourself you handed over to someone who, it turns out, was never equipped to actually receive it. Not because you gave it wrong, because they couldn't hold it, period. But there's something true on the other side of that grief too. Once you actually see it, not just understand it intellectually, but feel it settle into your body, something loosens, the fog starts lifting, and you begin to understand that leaving wasn't giving up. It wasn't cruel, and it definitely wasn't a failure on your part. Walking away from a relationship that was quietly draining you dry might be the most self-aware thing you've ever done. It's clarity wearing the disguise of courage. It's the moment you stop performing devotion for someone who was never actually watching you, only watching what you could give them. And that's the moment, the quiet one, no drama, no final confrontation, when their entire internal world starts to come apart. Here's what almost never gets shown to you afterward. They are not calling you at 2 a.m, crying, telling you they're falling apart without you. They're not sitting across from a therapist, finally admitting that losing you cracked open something they've spent their whole life avoiding. They're not posting something raw and honest online about how hollow things feel now. They are not showing up at your door to say the words you spent years hoping to hear, that you were right, that they were wrong, that they finally understand the damage, that they're genuinely sorry. None of that is coming. And if some part of you has been quietly waiting for it, holding a little space open just in case, I want to say this as plainly as I can. The fact that it isn't happening doesn't mean they're fine. It means something bigger. It means whatever is happening inside them right now is so destabilizing, so threatening to the version of themselves they've spent years constructing, that showing it to you, to anyone, simply isn't something they can do. Maybe not yet, maybe not ever. What's actually happening inside them when you leave isn't grief, at least not the kind you'd recognize in yourself. It's not sadness, and it's not the dull, aching loneliness of missing someone you loved. What's actually going on, and what the research on this points to pretty consistently, is destabilization. It's their constructed identity fracturing. It's the sudden, violent removal of an external support system that had been quietly holding their entire sense of reality in place. Picture it like this. Imagine you've spent your entire adult life walking with a prosthetic limb, not because you lost something, but because you never developed the real thing to begin with. You learned to move with it so well that nobody, maybe not even you, can tell the difference anymore. And then one day, it's gone. You can't stand, you can't move the way you used to. The absence exposes exactly what the presence had been quietly covering up the whole time. That's what you were. Not a partner they chose out of genuine mutual love, the prosthetic, and now you're not there. What follows first is panic, though not the kind they'll ever let you see, and possibly not even a kind they're consciously aware of themselves. Underneath whatever composed face they're showing the world in the days after you leave, there's a real alarm response going off, and it's hard to overstate how disorienting that is for them. Their nervous system had essentially calibrated itself around the steady supply of validation you were providing. Suddenly, there's nothing to regulate against. The input it depended on has just been cut off. What that produces is a kind of internal static, restlessness, difficulty focusing, a low hum of dread they can't quite name and therefore can't do anything about. Some researchers describe this as narcissistic injury, and it's not a minor thing. When the main source of supply disappears abruptly, the response can genuinely resemble withdrawal from a substance. Their internal balance tips over, and they're left scrambling in a silence they don't know how to survive. It shows up physically too. Elevated stress hormones, disrupted sleep, appetite changes, trouble concentrating, because they've never built the internal tools to process feelings like this on their own. Their entire strategy has always been to borrow regulation from someone else, rather than build their own. So now they're flooded with nowhere to put it. A flooded narcissist is unpredictable. And this is usually where you see the behavior that confuses people the most. The part that makes you doubt everything you thought you understood. Out of nowhere comes a wave of affection. Messages at strange hours, apologies that sound more sincere than anything you heard the entire time you were together, big gestures. Promises that things will be different this time, tender references to memories you shared, delivered with an emotional weight that feels completely real. It gets under your skin. It makes you wonder if leaving is what finally woke them up, if losing you is what made them finally see clearly. This has a name, hoovering, and understanding what it actually is, not what it feels like in the moment, but what it's functionally doing, might be one of the most protective things you can learn here. Hoovering isn't love, and honestly, it isn't really about you at all. It's a supply-seeking behavior. Their system has registered that its main source of regulation is gone, and it's sending out every signal it has to pull that source back in. The intensity you're feeling from them is real, in the sense that the need underneath it is real. But that need was never about you as a whole person. It was about what you represented, the stability, the mirror that reflected back a version of themselves they could only access through your eyes. They're not reaching out because they miss you specifically. They're reaching out because they miss who they got to be when you were around. And if you go back, and if the hoovering does its job, nothing actually changes. The old pattern reasserts itself almost immediately. The warmth fades, the dynamic resets, because the actual problem was never about timing or communication or circumstances that could be fixed with the right conversation. The actual problem was a fundamental inability to meet you as an equal, to regulate their own emotions without pulling from you, to love you without slowly consuming you. Missing you, however intensely, doesn't rewire that. Pain by itself doesn't create change. Pain combined with real accountability and a sustained willingness to do genuinely hard internal work. That combination can create change. But that combination is rare, and it's especially rare in this kind of personality structure. So whether the hoovering fails outright, or you simply don't respond, or you do go back and then leave again, with more clarity this time, the panic underneath just deepens. What comes after that is the part almost nobody talks about, maybe because it's the part that's hardest to see from the outside. The dramatic pleading has died down. The hoovering has stopped working or been shut down entirely. And what's left, once all that noise clears out, is something the narcissist has been avoiding for a lot longer than the time they knew you. It's silence. Their own company, their own reflection, with no mirror around to soften it. That, more than anything else, is where the real difficulty starts for them. There's a specific kind of quiet that settles in after a relationship like this ends. You've probably felt a version of it yourself. It's disorienting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. It arrives after the arguments stop, after the emotional whiplash finally levels out, after that constant background hum of not knowing which version of the person you're going to get today finally goes silent. And when all that noise disappears, the quiet can feel almost unbearable at first. Not because you miss the chaos itself, but because the chaos, painful as it was, had become the rhythm your life was built around. Even a difficult rhythm is a kind of familiarity, and familiarity, even when it's not good for you, can feel like comfort simply because it's known. But here's the thing worth sitting with. They're in that same silence too. For you, it's uncomfortable. For them, it's closer to catastrophic, because you weren't just someone they loved or thought they loved. You were their noise. You were the constant stream of external input keeping their inner world from ever going fully quiet, fully still, fully honest. Every conversation, every reaction, every bit of attention you gave them, good or bad, it didn't really matter which, registered as proof to their nervous system that they existed, that they mattered, that the story they told about themselves held up. You were the audience their whole performance depended on, and now the theater's empty. And in an empty theater, a performer eventually has nowhere left to go but to stand there alone and actually look at what's on the stage with them. What they find in that silence usually isn't what they expected. They expect to be fine, because they always expect to be fine. That's part of the story they've carried, the one that required your participation to stay believable. The story says they're resilient, exceptional, the kind of person who doesn't really need anyone. For a while, maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks, they lean hard into that story. They go out, they perform being okay, they post things that suggest they're thriving, they find someone else to talk to, someone new to reflect their best qualities back at them because the supply has to be restored and fast. In the beginning, almost any source will do, but it doesn't fully work, not the way it did with you. This part rarely gets discussed and it matters, so it's worth staying with for a moment. A narcissist doesn't just need supply in the generic sense. They need supply that's specifically tuned to them, someone who knows or believes they know the exact shape of their insecurity well enough to soothe it precisely. A stranger can offer admiration, a new partner can offer attention and excitement. But what you were providing, after months or years of quietly learning the specific architecture of their wounds, was something far more precise. You knew exactly what to say and when. You knew which reassurances actually landed. You'd been trained, often without ever realizing it was happening, to be the ideal regulator for their particular emotional makeup. A new person can't replicate that overnight. Some never can. So even with new distractions in play, even with fresh attention coming from somewhere else, there's a hollowness that doesn't go away. A specific kind of emptiness where your presence used to sit. And that hollowness eventually forces something the narcissist has spent their entire life architecting their world to avoid. It forces them to look inward. And what they find there, once the distractions thin out and the quiet becomes impossible to outrun, usually traces back much further than your relationship, further back than the person you actually knew. It goes all the way back to where this pattern started in the first place. The narcissistic wound is rarely about the present moment. At its root, it's almost always about the past. Most of the research on how narcissistic patterns develop points to something fairly consistent, not usually a single traumatic event, but a repeated pattern over years. Sometimes it comes from a childhood where a child was praised constantly, but only for performance, only for image, only conditionally, never simply for being who they actually were. Other times it comes from the opposite, a childhood of emotional neglect, where a child learned early that their real self wasn't enough, wasn't safe to show, wasn't lovable as it actually was. Different paths, but they land in roughly the same place. Either way, the child absorbs the same core lesson. The authentic self isn't acceptable, so it has to be hidden. What matters for survival is becoming whatever version of themselves earns approval, admiration, and reflection back as worthy. And that lesson, learned early and reinforced over years, is the quiet architecture underneath everything that came later. The charm, the need for constant validation, the inability to sit alone with themselves, and ultimately, the way they related to you. None of that erases what they did or excuses the harm. Understanding where a wound comes from isn't the same as excusing what someone does with it, but it does explain why walking away from you creates something closer to an earthquake for them than an ordinary breakup. You weren't just a person they lost. You were the last thing standing between them and a silence they've been running from their whole life. And that's really the point worth holding on to. Not so you can feel triumphant about their suffering. That's not what this understanding is for. It's so you can finally stop carrying guilt for leaving. Stop second-guessing whether you were too harsh. Stop wondering if you should have tried one more time. You gave what you had to give, for as long as you reasonably could, to someone who was never structured to actually receive it. That was never a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of what they were missing. Walking away didn't break them. It simply stopped covering for something that was already broken long before you ever arrived. And the peace you're looking for isn't on the other side of them finally admitting what they did. It's already available to you now. In the quiet, you were brave enough to choose.